I'd like to share a little bit with you about how I came to write the book and why I thought it was important to do so, and then maybe some passages from the book itself. And I've already had somewhat of an introduction here, but I was born in Napanee, raised on Simcoe Street, youngest of 4 girls, and attended NDSS and then Queen's with a Bachelor of Arts degree, and then pursued a career in banking and financial planning. As I said, I retired in 2019, and the world got locked down, and I didn't have anything to do with myself except jigsaws and baking and eating my baking. Decided it was time to get busy and write the book that I had always wanted to write about Dad's story from the World War II. And I really had no excuse because I had a lot of time on my hands. And I'm not an expert on World War II, so nobody out there can challenge me on that. But I am somewhat of an expert on my dad, and any relatives in the audience aren't allowed to challenge me on that either. So I wanted the book to be as authentic as possible. I didn't want to lose anything by trying to impose my own interpretation or impressions of what Dad was trying to say. So I just didn't try to put it into my own words. Much of it is the original transcripts. And for all intents and purposes, I'm just a narrator who tries to bring everything together. My daughter, Jennifer, who's a lawyer by education, she decided during the pandemic lockdown that she needed a career change. And because of her love of books and her analytical mind, she pursued editing. And by that time, I had decided I was going to self-publish my book. So it was a real gift to me that Jennifer and I could work on this book together. And I don't think this is how it's usually done, but for me, the title of the book came first. And if you allow me to, I'm just going to read you some of the preface of the book because it explains why. This is a story about my dad, Lorne Shetler, and a life well lived. A life that was punctuated by the Second World War and his capture by the Germans. A life that later centered on his wife Ruth and the 4 daughters that he raised with her. It may not be 100% accurate in every detail, but I won't apologize for that. I've done my best to transcribe his handwritten notes, his prisoner of war log, and letters preserved by my grandmother. My grandmother kept all of his letters as well as telegrams from the Red Cross and Royal Canadian Air Force personnel pressed between the pages of one of his accounting books. And it's under the display case there and open to a page where you can see letters that Dad wrote, dear folks and dear mother. He wrote home while he was on training and also from the prisoner of war camp. Over time, those letters got fused to the pages of the text, so I couldn't read all of the letters front and back, but I recorded what I could read without destroying the originals. And I'm sure Grandma Shetler never realized the gift that she was giving her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren and generations to come by preserving all those personal mementos. As I said, wherever possible, the story's in Dad's own words, and as such, the reader may find some of the terminology is no longer appropriate, but it reflects the time in which it was written, and it's not meant to offend anyone. I remember my dad returning home from a funeral visitation here in Napanee, and he, with a tear in his eye, he said of his friend, he was a good man. And then he added, I just hope when I go, someone will say the same of me. Lorne Melvin Shetler was a good man. He was one of the best. And I record these memories so the generations that follow will know that he and many others like him are responsible for the freedom they enjoy today. Each man and woman who served had their own story, and this is my dad's. In Dad's journal, he talks about growing up on a farm just east of Minks Bridge on the Newburgh Road. His parents have both been teachers, but after they were married, they decided to farm. My father's own writings, I feel, give a real insight into what it was like growing up in a rural farming community during the Depression. And as was typical for the time, they were a large family. There was 6 boys and 2 girls. And before somebody starts counting, there was only 7 kids there, but my Uncle Ralph had not been born yet. Some would no doubt describe his family as poor after reading of his youth. But that's what it was like for many, if not most, families during the Depression. My grandparents, Stuart and Ethel Shetler, were hard workers and eventually managed to purchase farms for their sons who decided to farm, and they financially compensated the the rest of the boys and the 2 girls who chose another livelihood. Dad talks of his childhood on the farm and attending the little one-room schoolhouse on the Palace Road, which I believe is still the Pringle farm. And you go up Palace Road and you take the 90-degree turn to go over to Newburgh Road. There was a little one-room schoolhouse right on that corner. And that's some of the kids standing outside of the one-room schoolhouse. Have a little. I've lost my. Didn't lose it. I just laid it down there. So this picture was given to me by Ralph Bancona, and he gave me permission to put it in the book. It was a small school. 2 of the people in there are not related, but all the rest of they're either Vancona boys or Shetler boys. And my dad is on the end there with the big ears. He talks of carrying his lunch to school in an old honey pail, and of his clothes being sewn by my grandmother, made from dyed flour sacks, and of going barefoot in summer months. It's hard for most of us to relate to that, but as I said, it was a sign of the times back then. Dad's account of childhood is quite factual. He doesn't sugarcoat it. He doesn't complain about hardships. He just tells his story. And in those days, it was not uncommon for children to leave school after grade 8 to help out on the farm. Dad was fortunate to go on to high school. He's starting grade 9 when he was 10 years old, according to his story. But on the table over here, I found his grade 8 graduation diploma, and he turned 11 3 months before. So, still pretty young. His age and his lack of preparation for the maths and scientists meant he repeated grade 9, but then he graduated grade 13 at the age of 16. He was encouraged to pursue a teaching career, but given his youth, he felt he lacked the maturity to teach, which makes sense. He would be like a year or 2 older than most of his students. But it was the Depression, and work was scarce and money was very tight. So he tried a few different jobs to make extra money, but it was tough, and he found himself helping out on area farms, cutting firewood for peanuts. I remember him talking about he and one of his brothers using those old cross-cut saws on logs, and they were getting $2 a week to spend the whole week cutting firewood. Canada joined the war in September of 1939, and farmers were exempt from conscription. But seeing how limited his prospects were for decent work, by late 1942, Dad was toying with the idea of signing up. And in January 1943, just shy of his 26th birthday, he enlisted with the RCAF. My dad was the only one in the family to join the forces and go overseas, but he wanted to fly. When he sent for his birth certificate in order to enlist, it came back in the name of Lauren Basil Shetler, but he was told his name was Lauren Melvin. So he asked my grandmother about it, and she said, "Oh, that's right. We were going to call you Basil. We just changed our mind." But he just neglected to mention it to him or to the government, but he did eventually have his name legally changed. Dad was accepted into training with the Royal Canadian Air Force, and after some time at Toronto Exhibition Grounds, which had been repurposed to barracks and training grounds, he was sent to Trenton for guard duty, followed by Oshawa for pilot training on Tiger Moss. This is a picture from 1948 from the 43 from the Kingston Whig Standard. And Dad has like the pilot gear on, but that was early in his training. And he never fulfilled his wish to be a pilot, but he was flying, and that's an undated photo, but taken around the same time when he was in Saskatchewan at training school. My dad was sent west to Saskatchewan for bombing and gunnery school, and from his letters home, you can imagine he liked to stir things up a little bit, but not any big trouble. Mostly when he was in Trenton, he would sneak off the base and hitchhike to Napanee to see my mother. They weren't married yet, his girlfriend. Or he talks about being in Dafo, Saskatchewan, and one of the other fellows was from the area, so his brother would come over with the car and sneak them out to dances on Saturday night and such, but they weren't supposed to be leaving the base. Then he came back to Malton for navigational training, map reading, aircraft recognition, and the like, and eventually he became the bomb aimer. This is a picture of Dad beside a plane called a ferry bomber, which is F-A-E-R-Y, and they were used for training pilots in the Second World War. In March of 1943, he left Halifax on the Queen Elizabeth, which sounds pretty classy, but there was about 18,000 on board, and not quite what you'd call a luxury cruise. They zigzagged across the Atlantic for 6 days to evade the submarines and landed in Greenock, just east of Glasgow. And training continued there and then the Orkney Islands. Dad talks about having an opportunity to see a fair amount of the UK because if the weather was bad, they couldn't fly, and it was Scotland and England, and the weather was bad a lot. He found it was frustrating how little flying time that they were actually getting, and you can hear that in his letters to my grandmother, but you can also hear how friendships were developing between the members of the flight crew and the ground crews. And for Dad, especially with his pilot, Ferdy. Ferdy wore 3 shoulder patches, according to my dad. He was born in Guatemala to a wealthy family, and his parents divorced. He lived with his mother in California, and then I'm not sure just how, but he ended up enlisting in the Canadian Air Force. So he was their pilot. He was the same age as my dad, and they became very close friends. So December 1943, Dad spent his first year overseas, and this is a menu from the officers' mess. It was their Christmas dinner, 1943. And Dad wasn't an officer yet, but he was invited to their dinner. And his flight engineer, Mac, had all of his friends, the guys that were at the dinner, sign the menu. And he sent it back to his wife, Phyllis, in Victoria, BC. And it was given to an historian by the name of Michael LeBlanc after the war, and he passed it on to me. Michael had done a lot of research on 429 Squadron, which was my dad's, and he did eventually interview my dad. He turned down the interview many, many times, and I wasn't aware until I started writing the book that Dad actually did end up giving him an interview, and I was able to get in touch with Michael, and he sent me a lot of information and some of these things. So on the second page of the menu, I'm not sure if you can read the writing at the top there, but it says, it's a note to Phyllis, his wife. It says, below you will find some of December 25th's best and definitely some of the worst people in the world. Some of them swear, most of them steal, and all of them drink. But they are all my friends and yours, Phyllis, and they wish you all the best for 1944. Next posting, Canada. Sadly, there was never a next posting for Mac. If you can see the 2 asterisks bracketing a name in the middle there, if I can see it, right here, it's signed Air Raid Shetler. So that's my dad, obviously. I'm not sure if it was a nickname. I never heard it until I saw this menu, but there's the obvious Shetler, shelter, and it's wartime, but I don't know if it was actually his nickname or he just put it there. He was posted to Scapa Flow, Scotland, then the Isle of Man, and subsequently to the Operational Training Unit near Stratford on Avon. Dad explains there they practice circuits and bumps, which is an aircrew's term for touchdowns and quick takeoffs. And in his notes, he told a few pretty scary touchdowns. Takeoffs weren't bad, the touchdowns weren't great. And this is Dad with his crewmates on their top of their plane. That's Dad there. When Dad was stationed at RAF Skabray, Kirkwall, Orkney Islands, he wrote a letter home saying to my grandmother, the only fault to find with the base so far is the way the station is scattered so far apart. I think that if I can't get a bicycle, I'm going to wear out a lot of boots. But you can see in the next picture that they all got bicycles. It's the only way to get around the base. This next picture is, they got to name their plane. It was a brand new plane, and they called it the Reich Express. And I don't know how clearly you can see it from there. That's Hitler being flushed down a toilet. He told my grandmother that they were going to have a pretty girl flushing the toilet, but I guess they didn't let them do that. But they did let him put Hitler's head on it. Dad does tell Graham in a letter that he had run into a Gus White from Napanee. I don't know if anybody here remembers that name or not. I just included it because he is from Napanee. They were both at the same training base. And Gus had a subscription to the Napanee Beaver, and they were posting all the papers to him. And he had 4 recent editions, and he gave them to my dad to read. And you will see in the book, there's a couple on the table there that are from the Napanee Beaver from that time. So eventually Dad was posted to Leeming Base in Yorkshire, and the training stopped and the bombing missions began in earnest. In an interview, he relates, the first trip was the worst. A 5-hour night flight, then red iron coming up at you at 20,000 feet. It was pretty scary the first time, he said, but I can't imagine that only the first trip was scary. That's what they were facing all the time. On their first mission, a second crew that they had lived and trained with didn't come back from that mission. And though that plane and crew had been shot down, there were some survivors. As it turned out, Dad ran into the bomb aimer from that other crew after the war, and he was working at customs in Niagara Falls. And Dad didn't know it till the day he ran into him, but he had bailed out, and a couple others from his plane, and met with the resistance and was able to go across the Alps to Spain and then back to England by boat. So he was very fortunate. The day Dad saw him, he was trying to cross the border at Niagara Falls. They'd gone for a boat cruise. He was with my mom and Dad's sister Hazel, and he just got his back pay from the RCAF because he had been discharged, and he was turned back from crossing the border because they had too much cash on him. So they asked how much cash he had. He told them $75. He said he actually had $200, but they told him 75 was too much. So relate that to crossing the border now when they say, do you have $10,000 or more on your person? It's $75 then. But as he turned around to leave, he felt somebody roughly grab his shoulder and almost knock him down, and it was the bomb aimer from that other crew, Mac, and he said, oh, tell him to go to hell. You're going across the border. So they were allowed to cross. Dad's flight log, and his flight log is also under the glass there, but I photocopied a few pages of, if anybody's interested, because it shows, where they were and where they had been. And it shows regular missions in the first 5 months of 1944. Operations including Frankfurt, Berlin, Stuttgart, Nuremberg, Paris, Ghent, and Dad lamented that the shorter missions did not qualify in the tally, that it would eventually mean the end of his duty and him coming home. A typical tour was 30 full missions, so they didn't all count. This is a typical debriefing. After each flight that they made, they were debriefed. This one's a little bit staged because it's taken by a professional photographer and was published in Canadian News Weekly. So that's for the crew with the Padre, and that's my handsome dad in the very middle there. Dad was one of a crew of 7, and as I said, he was the bomb aimer. This past May 24th was the 81st anniversary of Dad's 26th and final mission. Squadron 429 operations record book reported that that night the weather was fine and there was very good visibility, and they were headed from Leeming in Great Britain to Aachen, Germany. So you can see that was their flight path. Aachen was just inside the border to Germany. They're supposed to be bombing rail yards there. They said there was a little flak, but lots of troublesome fighter flares. 3 of the 15 aircraft participating from 429 Squadron, which was Dad's, were lost and reported missing. Their plane was hit by strange music and exploded as they returned from a mission over the rail yards in Germany. So I don't know if any of you have ever heard of strange music. It's a method of shooting upwards from below a target aircraft, and it was developed in the First World War, but its tactical use was not fully understood or really recognized in the Second World War, or by the Allies at that point in the Second World War. And of course, this was pre-internet days, so information didn't get disseminated the same way, and this knowledge was not available to the crews, and they were taken by surprise. The attacks came from seemingly out of nowhere, outside of their line of vision, so you couldn't counterattack because you didn't really know you were going to be hit. And surviving crews often incorrectly reported that they'd been hit by flak. The German Luftwaffe gave that method of shooting from underneath the plane the name Schreie Musik, pardon my German, but it roughly translated to strange music, so that's why they called it that. And I wonder if it wasn't, they could hear the sound of something coming at them, but they didn't actually see anything, and then they hit. I'd just like to read a quote from the book that talks about the night that Dad's plane was shot down. At 01:20 hours on May 25th, their luck runs out. Their kite has been hit. They hadn't seen any flak and did not know that enemy fighters could fly below them and shoot upwards. The plane is in an out-of-control dive from 8,000 feet with the port engines on fire. They're plummeting, everything turned upside down. They're plastered to the ceiling. And then the skipper, Ferdy, straightens it out a little, feathers the engines, and over the noise, they hear the order from Ferdy to bail out. They frantically check their parachutes, and out the front hatch they go, the cover jettisoned, and apparently Ron Rudd survived that crash, and he talks about the cover actually being stuck and then getting it open. So Ron Rudd, the navigator, is the first out. Lauren, the bomb aimer, was close behind, and time is running out. The wireless operator, Bert Dawson, jumps. It all takes about 4 seconds, but to them, it seems like a slow motion movie, and then the unimaginable happens. The plane carrying Lauren's 4 remaining crewmates and his best friends disappears in a fiery crash. It's a recorded time of 01:22 hours, just 2 minutes after they're hit. It won't register until later that his mates are gone, Ferdy, Mac, Bob, and Ken. The night my father's plane was shot down, Bomber Command reported 15 of 100 Halifax bombers and another 15 Lancaster bombers were shot down. Most were victims of 2 German Messerschmitt night fighter crews, and the man credited with downing Dad's aircraft was an ace pilot by the name of Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer. He was 22 years of age. He was touted to be one of the greatest night fighters of World War II and received Germany's highest military decoration that year for reportedly shooting down 121 4-engine planes, such as my dad's crew flew that night. This map shows where they were shot down. So they started out in Leeming. They went down to the German border and dropped their bombs, and they were headed back across the Netherlands and just between 2 small towns of Dongen and Tilburg when they were hit and the plane went down. My father was one of 3 survivors of this crew of 7, and he landed in a tree. And then he fell to the ground, landing on his tailbone atop a stump. He was injured, but managed to make his way to a farm where he hid until he was discovered by the farmer. Both he and the farmer who helped him were in great danger because the whole area was occupied by Germans. But he was fortunate that he was aided by the Dutch locals. And this farmer had 2 sons that were working with the Germans. So he was sympathetic to my father, but he couldn't keep him. And he passed him on to a Dutch family by the name of the Corneliussens, who were bakers in the village of Tilburg. This is Maria Corneliussen. Now, this picture was taken in 1989, so much later, and after her husband passed away. I don't have earlier pictures because they weren't exactly exchanging school pictures during the war. Plus, she would not want to have anything of my dad's hidden in her house, and he would not want to be hearing anything that would relate to them should he be captured. Not only did his family shelter him, but they would later tend the graves of the crewmates who perished that night. And they never forgot the young airmen that they sheltered, and after the war they were able to connect with my grandmother and eventually with my dad when he returned. And in the book that my grandmother kept all the letters, there are letters from them, and it helps fill in some of the events of that night that Dad couldn't even relate, but they could tell him about. Dad never saw them again after he left their home in 1944, but they did correspond with my grandmother, and they needed to know if Dad had ever made it back home, because once he left their house, they had no idea that he'd been captured or what had happened to him. But they corresponded with my grandmother, and then when Dad got back, they corresponded. And the bond with that couple was very strong, even though I spent, a matter of days in their home with them. And unfortunately, they never had children of their own. So once they both passed away, there's not been connection. But you'll see a few, maybe call them trinkets of Holland on the table over there, and they were gifts that after the war they sent home. Not sure what. I know that the glass shoe came to my dad. I think the other two actually may have gone to my grandmother Shetler, and then of course we ended up with them. The Dutch resistance group that the Corneliusens managed to connect my dad with was called Andre Group. The group was formed after the Germans invaded Netherlands in May of 1944. Earlier the same month, his dad was shot down, and they became the key organization in the Netherlands whose goal it was to sabotage the efforts of the Germans. Through their network, they arranged for accommodation, food, new identity cards, and documentation for anyone that needed to go into hiding. And of course, there was many that needed to go into hiding. There were Jews that were trying to escape persecution. There were students who remained steadfast in their refusal to work for Germans or pledge any allegiance to them, and individuals who refused mandatory employment in Germany. And of course, the Dutch soldiers who were trying to avoid capture by the Germans. The Germans were trying to put them into their own prisoner of war camps to keep them from meeting up with the Allied troops and fighting with them. They also provided assistance to pilots and crews who crashed over the Netherlands en route to Germany or on the return flight. That's happened to my dad. This one small arm of the Dutch resistance, known as Andre Group, was later credited with assisting 187 airmen to escape the Netherlands. I mean, think of that, 187 men who might never have returned to their families if not for the bravery of these people. And they were just a newly formed group. I'm a big reader of World War II stories. Many are fiction, but often they're based on fact. And the stories of the underground seem so surreal that it's hard to imagine the bravery of these people who daily put their lives, and the lives of their family at risk to aid these men from other countries. But the stories of their heroism are true. And the Dutch saw these fallen Allied airmen as their heroes, and to this day they honor those men and women. Their children are brought up with the knowledge that they're on this earth and living in a democratic country with freedom of choice because of these Canadian liberators. In some cases, I believe they pay them more honor and respect than some of our military get in our own country. And to me, of course, the Dutch are the heroes because they're the ones that saved my dad. This is map shows the route from where Dad was shot down in Tilburg to Antwerp, which was his next stop. And this is a picture of members of Andre Group, and a few of those men were the actual men that helped my dad. And I think I'm going to need another one. Sorry, maybe it's a bit later. After a brief period of healing and hiding, and with the help of Andre Group, Dad made his way to the Belgian underground. And this past June 6th was the 81st anniversary of the D-Day invasion. And ask any veteran of the Second World War where they were on D-Day, and they'll tell you exactly where they were. My dad was hiding in a hole in the ground on a farm not far from the Belgian border, and in the company of a couple other airmen as they waited to be moved out of Holland. This is a picture of my dad from the Dutch archives that my nephew Brad is here tonight. He's looked at all this stuff, but I'm quite sure Brad's never seen this either. So the other fellow in that picture, let's see if I can find his name here, was Bill Baker from 405 Squadron. And then the gentleman on the right was with Andre Group. And this was taken when they were on the farm, hiding in a hole. From the hole in the ground, they were transported to a farmhouse about 15 miles from the Belgian border, where Germans and horses arrived at that farm, and the Germans came through the front doors, and Dad and his mate scrambled out the back door, like literally. They were given bicycles by another farmer and told to head for the border. There was a note in the file that Dad said locals would rather lose their bicycles than their lives. So they wouldn't give them shelter, but they would give them their bicycles. And they told them to head for the border. They were guided by members of Group Andre. They traveled by bicycle, foot, train, and tram, eventually arriving at a safe house in Antwerp. The person in the Belgian underground who sheltered him after his arrival in Antwerp was a woman by the name of Yvonne de Ritter Files. And that's a picture of Yvonne that was taken after the war. I think this is about 1948 in that picture. And she had an apartment in Antwerp, and she was hiding mostly airmen, US, Canadian, British airmen in her apartment on the 3rd floor, which is the top window that you can see there. She was a young woman of about 30 at the time she hid my father in her Antwerp apartment. Her role was to provide safe lodging and food to the airmen who were brought to her. If she were caught, she would face execution. She had a contact who would retrieve the men at the appropriate time, then ostensibly find a way to transport them safely back to England. But she had no way of knowing that her contact in the underground, in the Belgian underground, was actually a traitor. Each cell of the underground operated in isolation so that they could not expose anyone else if they were captured. And Yvonne had no idea at the time that Donald was a traitor, or that many of, she called them her boys or her men, had been captured already. The night my dad was betrayed, she had 5 airmen staying in her small apartment. And it really was the stuff of movies. It was like, go out after dark, go to this corner, light a cigarette, take 2 puffs. You know, it was like the whole espionage thing. And this man is René van Meulen. His code name was Donald. He was the traitor. After the war, he was spotted living in Paris and working for the American Red Cross. But he was interrogated and stated, "You worked for your ideal, I worked for mine, money." And he was subsequently executed as a traitor. Dad and others like him who had the misfortune to encounter this faults line in the underground called the KLM line, no relationship to the airline, did not make it back to England, but rather to POW camps if they were lucky. He and his buddies were sold to German Gestapo for cash, and Donald took credit for betraying 157 Allied airmen and another 100 of Group Andre, according to notes from Michael LeBlanc, the historian. There's some question about that was his bragging, that it was that many, what it actually was, but there was a lot. And I just want to say a word about Yvonne, the woman that kept Dad in her apartment, and the other airmen. I remember the name growing up, but the context was lost on me. But she did come to Napanee and visit Mom and Dad, and I have the article from the Napanee Beaver. This woman had come to visit. She was then living in Hollywood, actually. And she wrote a book called Quest for Freedom. And she recounts her experiences with the underground, including my dad. So there's a blue book over there on the table. That's her book, Quest for Freedom. And I just did a little photocopy of the page that has Dad's story because his picture is on it as well. And she was also a featured guest on a show some of you might remember. It was called This Is Your Life with Ralph Howard. And in 1955, Dad had been invited to go to Hollywood and be part of the taping for this show, This Is Your Life. But my mother was pregnant for me, so now you know how old I am. And there was 3 more kids at home, and it just wasn't going to happen that he would go. But some of his fellow captives from that night actually attended that taping of the show, and I have a copy of that tape. And I've made another copy, and the museum is going to keep it in the archive with Dad's stuff, the This Is Your Life show. So she was captured and tried and sentenced to death for her role in the underground, and managed to survive as the war ended, and she was released within hours of her scheduled execution. And in that show, This Is Your Life, she talks about, she always thought it would be in front of a firing squad. So she had gotten herself used to the idea that if she was caught, she was going to be shot. And they came in and said, "Oh, you're not being shot, you're going to be hung." And that freaked her out. So this on the show, he said, "How did you must have been so scared." And she said, "I just all night long just went over in my mind what the process would be. And by morning, I was calm. And in the morning, she was released from the prison and escaped execution. But her father, who was not a member of the Underground, and I'm not sure that he was even aware of Yvonne's participation, but he was arrested for being a collaborator, and he was executed by injection. This picture is jumping 50 years ahead, I know, but the man with my father there, this is on the occasion of my parents' 50th wedding anniversary, and the other man's name is Charlie Sherlaw. And Charlie was in the apartment that night with my dad. The two of them and another man were together when they were sold to the Germans. And Charlie's actually on that show, This Is Your Life, for the filming, and talks about that night. And Charlie passed away shortly after that picture was taken, actually, but he's the one that provided me with a copy of the show. So following my dad's being sold to the German Gestapo, he and his mates were housed in an Antwerp prison. He was still suffering from the back injury he sustained when he bailed out of the plane. And surprisingly, says in that Antwerp prison, he was given heat treatments for his back. He said they were held for 2 weeks. It was very crowded, unsanitary, terrible, but they were giving him heat treatments on his back. So go figure. 21 of the men that were there at that time were then moved to a Luftwaffe prison in Brussels. And after 2 days in solitary confinement and being interviewed, they were shipped by rail car to Dusseldorf and not to Frankfurt. His journal states that between July 6th and 10th, he was shipped by freight in a hot, cramped car without proper ventilation or adequate rations to Luft 7 in Bangkok. He was provided with a logbook courtesy of the YMCA in Switzerland, and I can only surmise that that must have come in a Red Cross package or something. I don't know how else they would get them, but they were given to the POWs. The little book on the right there that has log written in tape, and it's got Dad's name underneath. So they were asked if they were captured to record what happened to them, and then if they made it home, they could be debriefed, or if their logbooks were found, they would know what had happened to them in the camps. And Dad was very, very faithful about doing that. So jump back 50 years again. That's the route Dad took from the apartment in Antwerp, Belgium, to arrive at the first prison camp that he was in Luft 7. This is the telegram that was sent to my grandparents, and telling them that Dad had finally been found, because they knew he was missing, but this tells them that they found him and that he was actually a prisoner of war. And by that time, that's July 27th, so Dad had already been missing 2 months before my grandparents got that notice. And then this is a letter that Dad wrote that came through the Red Cross, and it was actually written earlier on June 14th. But if you look at the top of it, there's a date stamp on there that says September 6, 1944, and it says in there that you can write up to 25 words, but they must be strictly personal. So I'm guessing that that lapse in time, that was almost 3 months, was because they were vetting all the letters that were getting out of the prisoner of war camp. And so it took that long for the letter, it was September, before my grandparents got that, and he'd been shot down in May. This is his prisoner of war picture. Still pretty handsome. And he actually looks a lot like my grandson Liam. I wanted to put the pictures side by side, but Liam's going to be 16 next week, and he forbid me to do that. So. And these are not given out like class pictures that, you know, when you're in a prisoner of war camp. But what happened was when that camp got liberated by the Russians, Dad and a friend or friends broke into the offices because the guards had deserted the POW camp, and he retrieved a couple pictures of himself, and I have no idea how else he might have taken. But, you know, over the years, I periodically pulled out my dad's prisoner of war log and started to read it, and mostly whenever there was a school history project. And I think, well, this would make a great story. And Dad, like many other vets, didn't want to talk about it, so that didn't happen. And most of you will remember Mr. E, the history teacher, and he was a neighbor, and he knew Dad quite well, and he always take me aside and said, I want your project to be on your dad, but Dad wanted none of it. But fortunately, we have the logbook, and there was the expectation that captured airmen would record their experiences, and Dad did that. Found it very emotional to read the daily entries and all those letters home and the book from my grandmother, but really nothing prepared me for the way I felt when I really started to write this and go through all of the material. I would take breaks and I'd be crying, and it just struck home that the dangers he'd actually faced in all of this. It's kind of like watching a movie and then realizing your dad's the star, the hero of the movie. And if Dad heard me say that, he would absolutely be mortified, right, Brad? So as I said, as an adolescent, I started to read the POW log more than once. I get to the part that mainly consisted of what he had to eat that day. And as a teenager, I would just quit reading because who cares? Like, it's, 2 lines about what he had to eat. It was only as an adult that I realized what the long march was all about. And that was what my dad was really writing about. He was talking about survival. And he was one of the lucky ones because he did survive. This map shows the locations of different prisoner of war camps. I don't know whether I can, if you can see the two, there's a couple asterisks, but there's also a piece of dirt on the map. But anyway, these are my reading, those ones are distance. Anyway, during the Long March in the winter of 1945, thousands of prisoners were forced marched across Poland and Germany in an attempt to keep ahead of the advancing Allies. And they were ill prepared for the sub-zero temperatures, and the rations did not even meet subsistence level. His one-line entries in the journal during that time were truly a tale of survival. And my cousin Ron's here tonight, and his mom Lorna, who's first grandchild in the Shetler family and named after my dad, and she recalls a letter that my dad wrote Aunt Helen, his sister, and tells her that all they had was grass soup. And so Lorna went out and cut some grass and put it in a cup of water, stirred it up, and tried to eat it. She couldn't understand why my dad would want to eat grass soup. My dad was forced marched from one prison camp to another. The winter of 45 was one of Europe's coldest of the 20th century, with blizzards and temperatures that were between -20 and -25 Celsius. He followed his group followed what was known as the Central Route, starting at Stalag Luft 7 at Bankau in Silesia, Germany, which is now actually Poland, and ending at Stalag 3A in Luckenwald, 30 kilometers south of Berlin. He set out on January 19th, 1945, and he marched daily until February 5th, when they arrived in a town called Goldberg. And from there, they loaded them onto cattle cars, 54 men to a car intended to transport 10 horses. His final destination before the end of the war and his liberation was Stalag Luft 3. So the other map was hard to see, but that's the distance between the two prisoner of war camps that Dad was in. Doesn't look huge on that map, but I'll tell you it was. This is a memorial. It's actually in Britain, and it's RAF, but it depicts Air Force prisoner of war trudging through the snow after they were forced by their guards to leave the prison camps in the face of the Russian advance. Dad's log entry on February 8th, 1945, at the end of the Long March for him, he says, "Another hell of a night in the railway car. Still no food or water. Taken out around noon to Stammlager 3A. Given a bath and food and a bed on the floor. Glory be. Barbed wire again at Luckenwald." He was so excited to be back in a prisoner of war camp. In his diary, he says they were in a building with wooden floors and room to at least lie down. His bridge partner, Joel Keller from Vancouver, had one blanket, having dropped his other one when it got too heavy to carry after being on the road for so long. Dad still had 2 blankets, so they slept together in all of their clothes, sharing the 3 blankets between them to survive the cold night. To them, it was a luxury, so I guess luxury is relative to your experience. In early March, he reports that they hear the raids on Berlin nightly. The weather's cold and miserable, and rations very sparse. Typically 1 loaf of bread per day, no margarine. It would be split between 7 or 8 men, depending on whether they received a Red Cross parcel that day. And many days there was some soup for dinner, but there was no potatoes, no meat, maybe the odd onion. So basically they were getting 2 cups of hot water at night. Receipt of cigarettes or tobacco in one of the parcels was a real cause for celebration, even if you were not a smoker, because they could use it as a currency to buy other things from other inmates. On April 12th, after many aborted attempts to move their camp, he and the fellow prisoners were moved to another rail car with a plan to keep ahead of the advancing Allied forces. But all the routes of escape had been blocked by that time by either the US or the Russians. So they find themselves back behind barbed wire again, and Dad said that he expected to be there until he was finally relieved. He speaks shortly after that entry, he speaks about 150 men arriving in their camp, and they had walked from Lambsdorff, Silesia, Poland, and they were all that was left of 400 men who started that 1,000-mile march. And if you go online, which you probably don't want to, it just shows people dropping along the sides of the road. It couldn't go on. In the days following that, there was rumors of the Russians and the Americans being very close, and a wing commander tells them that they're now surrounded. Some RCAF and RAF decide to make a run for it, but most don't make it, and they are buried in cemeteries for Allied prisoners within German camps. Then the Germans evacuate the camp. The officers in control of the cookhouse and other officers are just gone. They take off. And on Sunday, April 22nd, their camp is taken by the Russians without a fight. It's hailed as their Liberation Day, but in fact, they're just in captivity under a different army, the Russians. The town of Luckenwalde is close, and it's full of Allied troops and food and cigarettes, but there's still very strict rules about leaving camp, and you could be shot for not obeying them, and men were. They began to hear stories from the liberating troops. One of the more disturbing, says Dad, was of a camp near Lubin, Poland, where 11,000 people reported gassed and cremated. In fact, the number we now know was much, much higher, 78,000 by conservative estimate in that camp alone. The horrors of the Holocaust were not known to the POWs until much later. By May, the camp is still standing by to be evacuated, but the Russians are still maintaining control. So on 7th of May, Dad and 3 of his friends commandeered bicycles, which is a nice term for stole, I believe, and they left the camp to join an American convoy, and they were shot at by the Russians as they left. But Dad said, yeah, they weren't very good shots. They crossed the Elbe River with American troops, and at last they considered themselves liberated. Dad began his journey home via Brussels, then England. In Brussels, they got cleaned up, they were given some British Army uniforms and a little bit of money, and he and a friend set off on foot and promptly got lost, and I think alcohol a little bit to do with that. They were celebrating, and an American MP car stopped them and said, you know, where are you boys from? And Dad replied, Canada, followed by Ontario, followed by Napanee, and the fellow said, well, Howard, Mickey, Dowling, and all the boys. And it turned out the fellow had been the Coca-Cola delivery man for the town of Napanee. When Dad got back home, he became close friends with Jack Pearson. Some of you will remember Jack. He was an ex-RCAF pilot, and he flew Dakotas ferrying the POWs from Brussels back to England. And the two of them always wondered if Dad might have been one of Jack's passengers. And Donnie Pearson, some of you know him, he still lives here in town. This is a telegraph sent to my grandfather, Stuart, saying that Dad had arrived back in England. And this is a Marconigram from my dad telling them he'd arrived back. So here's your piece of information for the day, because I had to look it up. A wireless telegram using radio waves is a Marconigram, and a telegram is electric telegraph using Morse code. This is a picture of the Ile-de-France carrier in Halifax. This is from the Halifax Gazette, so I think the only way my grandmother could have had this if Dad got the newspaper when he arrived back in Halifax and cut this out and gave it to her. It was the 6th largest passenger ship in the world at that time, and it was used to repatriate thousands of Canadian troops at the end of the war. And it's really hard to see that in that picture, but if you see the actual picture of it and kind of take a magnifying glass, the troops are hanging off every piece of rope and over the sides, and they're just so happy to be back. And a lot of those men were POWs. I said earlier his is a story of survival, and although much of it took place between the time he was shot down and his eventual return to Canada, I can assure you the story had a happy ending, or I wouldn't be here to tell you his story. He came back to the farm at Napanee, and that's, can I go back one? No, I cannot. The last picture was he was with his parents and his sister Hazel. This is a picture of my dad with my mom and his sister Hazel, and my mom, Ruth Boston, and my dad had been dating prior to Dad signing up, and they corresponded through the war years. And my mom was also a good friend of Dad's sister Hazel, and so any information that the Shetler family got about Dad was always sent along to my mom. Mom was the youngest of 4 children, raised on a farm in Holly's Woods, south of Napanee, and her brother Leslie was also fighting overseas. During the war, Mom worked as a carpenter in a factory in Malton building aircraft wings for Mosquito bombers. And as part of their carpenter training, they made toolboxes. So this is one of the toolboxes, and you can see she purchased a war bond. Her name's in there, Ruth Boston. What I don't understand is if you didn't have to give that back in to get money back, or whether she just didn't bother to do that. But, and this is not, we're not sure, right, Brad, but circa 1941 anyway. So when the war ended, and with it her job at Malton, she worked at unemployment insurance in downtown Toronto, and on holidays in Napanee in the summer of 45, she and Dad rekindled their romance. She quit her job a year later, and she came home to Napanee. They were married August 3rd, 1946, and anybody who takes Highway 2 to Kingston knows a little white church at Morven, just a tiny little building. I think it's still there. That's where they were married. This is a picture, this one, Bob Christie, and the next one, Ferdy. And they were 2 of Dad's close friends that were down on the plane that night. And eventually they moved these graves to Bergen-op-Zoom and some of the other larger Canadian cemeteries around the Netherlands. But the family that helped my dad would tend to these grave sites that were more local. These are the graves at Bergen-op-Zoom of 3 of the 4 graves. And these pictures were just taken this last May, actually. I haven't met him yet, but we've been corresponding. Long story how we found one another, but he was leading a walking tour of Canadians for the anniversary of the Liberation this year. It's called In Our Father's Footsteps, and they have been doing it every 5 years, and they literally walk across the Netherlands and retrace the path of Canadian liberators across the Netherlands, and they go through fields and small towns, and they hold parades for them. Anybody who joined, you had to be related to someone involved with Holland during the liberation to take part in it. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to go, but they even got an audience with Princess Marguerite, whose mother was Princess Juliana, was exiled in Canada during the war, and Marguerite was actually born in Ottawa. But they declared the hospital room extraterritorial, the Canadian government did, because she needed to only have Dutch citizenship to follow the Dutch royal line. So she went and met these people who walked across Holland this year, and they got to have an audience with her, and she thanked them, and the Dutch people still send, I'm sure you know, the tulip bulbs, 10,000 tulip bulbs to Ottawa every year to keep the thank you gifts going. And I'm excited to say I'm going to visit Bergen-op-Zoom Cemetery in April this year with my daughters. The remains of the 4th person in the plane was the tail gunner, Ken Jackson, and he was RAF actually, and I think there is a gravestone in his memory. in somewhere in England, but all they ever found of him was some ID that they found a few months later, and they think he perished in the explosion of the plane. And one thing that really struck me doing this is how young most of these men were. My dad was like 26. He was an older person. There was a lot of young men who lied about their age and signed up at 16 or 17. And there's just so many lives lost at a young age. And my dad always knew that he was one of the lucky ones that returned home, and he never stopped mourning those friends that he lost. And this picture, and there's a few on the table there, this is taken at the National Air Force Museum in Trenton. We're really lucky to have that so close by. So if you haven't gone, please check it out. It's the permanent home to 429 Squadron, which is Dad's squadron, also known as Bison Squadron, hence the bison at the top of it. And it was the unveiling that day in 2000. We went to this, and one dignitary there spoke of the contributions of this squadron to the war effort. And he also mentioned that 3 Halifax crew from 429 Squadron who had been shot down the night of May 24th. And my dad was the only one in attendance there that had firsthand knowledge of that crash, because he was in it. But I will say that they're playing the Reich Express that I showed you a picture of earlier. When they were on, my dad's crew was on leave, another crew took it up and they didn't come back. So his plane was lost. So 2 weeks later, they're back from leave and they go on this bombing mission to Aachen, and they're they're flying Dad's wing commander's plane. And of course, they got shot down and lost the wing commander's plane. And Dad never saw the wing commander again until that day at 429 Squadron. But Dad said, I think he'd forgiven me for crashing his plane. So, right, I've been overwhelmed and I've been heartwarmed by the number of people that have been interested in the book and by their reactions. And I especially appreciate those that have taken the time to let me know that they were touched by it, and those that shared their stories with me about their memories of my parents, or their stories about their own family and the connection to the war. And many people have said to me, your dad would be so proud you wrote this. And I'd like to think that both Mom and Dad would have been, but there's another part of me that's pretty sure that they would have been mortified to have everyone reading about them and disbelieving that anyone would be interested. So I thank each of you for showing your interest by being here tonight. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to leave you with these words. Come from a plaque that was gifted to my dad and his bunkmates for Christmas 1943 by a member of his ground crew, Carl Paul of Vancouver, at the Leeming RCAF training station. Can't tell you the source of the prayer because I don't know. But in a letter to my grandma, Dad said it was the best gift of the year, and the words are so appropriate for an air crew during wartime. Be thee, O Lord, within me to strengthen me, without me to watch over me to cover me, under me to hold me up, before me to lead me, behind me to bring me back, round about me to keep off my enemies on every side. Thank you for coming. If anybody has questions, if I can answer them, I will.